In 2021, Gleb Lisikh wanted to send his son to a summer course offered by his local high school. Alas, his son was rejected from attending the course, which was all about learning Java programming. It had nothing to do with the lad lacking prerequisites. Rather, Gleb's son was given the boot based on skin color? Good golly. How could a school, and for that matter, the Ontario Ministry of Education, tolerate such blatant racism? So it was that Gleb reached out to the Ontario Human Rights Commission, only to be shocked by the fact that the Ontario human rights racketeers had absolutely no problem with such blatant racism either. You see, when it comes to the Ministry of Education and the Ontario Human Rights Commission, racism in general is very bad, but in certain cases, racism is jolly good, which is to say, in this particular case, Gleb's son was refused entry because it was only open to Black students. For those kids who weren't Black, it wasn't a matter of being relegated to the back of the bus, but rather they were told to get the hell off the bus. Absolutely incredible. And joining me now is Gleb Lisikh himself, who recently wrote about his ordeal in C2C Journal. His article is entitled, "One Flew Over the Kangaroo Court, My Fight Against Human Rights Tyranny." Hey there, Gleb. Thank you so much for joining me. I read your article. It's downright surreal. I think that's the only word. How is it that we are now living in a province in which selective racism is not only tolerated by the government, but it's also government approved?
That's an interesting question. And more interesting is why you're asking me why we're living in this. I left the Soviet Union in 2000, and it was one of the reasons probably for me to leave. At that time, it was no longer a Soviet Union, but I had a full experience of that type of an attitudes. And why we are living in Canada, I don't know, with this type of attitudes where people can be segregated by all kinds of features, I don't know, irrelevant features, I guess, in this particular case for educational purposes. Why would the government segregate people by race, by the skin color?
Gleb, I think, isn't there some bitter irony here? Because I think if there's one individual on the planet currently rolling in his grave right now about this kind of approved racism, it's Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Some 50 years ago, he had the famous speech where he asked that someone not be judged by the color of their skin, but the content of their character. But the progressive left has done a 180 on this. Now they are judging people on the color of their skin. This is not anti-racism. This is racism, by the very definition. I'm just wondering how it is we got here in the first place.
I personally don't like the term anti-racism. I agree with you. It's just plain racism. There's no such thing as anti-racism. It doesn't matter what skin color you have. If you are judged by that skin color, it is racism. Although the Human Rights Tribunal thinks slightly differently, they think that the white people cannot be discriminated against. So that's, I guess, why this term anti-racism is popping up.
I go back to yesterdecade. For example, Gleb, my wife is originally from South Africa. Her and her family moved here in 1976. And I think South Africa was made a pariah, and rightfully so, for its odious system of apartheid. I mean, it was absolutely surreal that a white minority had extra special rights compared to the Black majority, and there was boycotts, divestment, sanctioned. South Africa couldn't go to the World Cup or the Olympics. I get it. But we've moved away from condemning apartheid-style racism to embracing it, it would seem.
I guess the official explanation to that, and I wrote about this in my article, is that there's that set of idea that there are ameliorating actions that are designed to bridge the gaps in between so-called oppressed or racialized minorities, the blacks being one of them. And this is a bit of a weird idea for me, in which way, let's say, the young people, the students, teenagers, or college grads are oppressed or racialized. There's no such thing in Canada, from my experience at least, right? The whole the idea of ameliorating, somehow compensating those happened 100 years ago is appalling and absurd. But that's the reason for that, right? Somehow there's that, I guess I can call it a critical race theory that purports that somehow there's that generational gap that people still suffer for. Really, it's unexplainable reason. It's difficult for me to explain it because I don't understand it. Right? It makes no sense to me. And in my article, I also gave an example that, let's say, well, in ancient times, in the beginning of the second millennia, Russia was oppressed by Mongol hordes, right? So they were under the Mongol hordes for 200-300 years. So what does that make me a racialized minority now because I suffer this cross-generational trauma dating back almost 2,000 years? It's absurd. Like, I mean, how long does that generational trauma, even if it existed, how long it's going to last? How do we measure if whatever ameliorating actions are being put in place are actually helping to bridge the gap? Is there a gap? How we measure that gap? Is that the skin color is the primary reason for that gap, whatever it is?